My name is Miriam Udel, and I am the Judith London Evans Director of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies. I hold joint appointments in the TAM Institute and also in the Department of German Studies, where my teaching focuses on Yiddish, language, literature, and culture. So I like to say that I'm something of an accidental Yiddishist. I did not grow up speaking Yiddish, and let me just pause and explain here that Yiddish is a hybrid or a fusion language of the Jewish people who lived in Central and Eastern Europe, really for about 1,000 years between the 10th century and the 20th or maybe even 21st century, depending on how you count and how you draw the borders. It's a language that fuses a largely Germanic and Slavic vocabulary with a Hebraic writing system and also elements of vocabulary from Hebrew and Aramaic, which is another Semitic language. And I did not grow up speaking this language, studying it, really having anything to do with it. So the whole way that I came to be learning it as a graduate student and then really learning it and simultaneously falling in love with it and deciding that I wanted to devote my life to studying its literature and culture, it involved a lot of serendipity. When I was thinking about going to graduate school, I should pause here and say that as an undergraduate, I did study literature and also Jewish studies. And for my senior thesis, I ended up kind of fusing the two and writing about a modern Israeli poet who wrote in modern Hebrew. And after college, I decided that I wanted to get a better grounding in ancient Jewish literature. And so I went to Israel and I studied for a couple of years. And then I came back to the States and I thought that I was going to work as a journalist. I had actually started filing some freelance pieces from Israel and seeing a little bit of success with that. And I love writing. I had always identified as a writer, thought that that's what I wanted to do. And I started freelancing that first year back and piling up rejection after rejection and realizing that most of the time you only get paid if your piece is accepted and that this was just not going to be a sustainable lifestyle. I needed to get a job or do something that offered a salary rather than paying me per piece. And I suppose because the amounts of money involved were so small to begin with, when I thought about graduate school, I didn't say, oh, well, that is a clear pathway to poverty. I said, oh, maybe a steady stipend would be actually a step up from where I am now, which I'm not sure that's a decision that I would make today, but that is certainly what I did as a very young 20-something. And so I decided to apply to graduate school, knowing that I was very interested in the relationship between literature and particularly fiction and the historical process of secularization. I was somewhat interested in how literature contributed to people's becoming secular, but I was really more interested in a kind of already secular or post-secular age, how people used literary fiction as a site of moral reasoning and thinking through ethical questions in a way that maybe they would have through a religious thought system in a different time. And so I visited with some professors that I had known as an undergraduate, whether I studied with them or not. And one of them was a Yiddishist, and she said, you know, the historical process of secularization took place very rapidly within the Jewish world, within a single generation in many cases. And so the story of how that happened is really encoded in Yiddish. And since you like languages and you're interested in these processes of secularization in relation to literature, you should really try to learn Yiddish. And I thought, you know what? I do like languages. And right now I'm studying Arabic just for fun. What if I pick up this Yiddish grammar book that she so kindly left for me in her mailbox? And so I did. And it was like a fish diving into water. I mean, there's an expression in Yiddish redt sich, Yiddish speaks itself. And that was very much my experience, which is not to in any way diminish the experience of people who struggle to learn a new language, which I think I would if I set out to learn a new language now. But at the time, I was still young. I had a lot of brain plasticity. I had recently been studying several languages. And so it was just a really fun process. And because I learned the language and got deeper and deeper into the literature, I was then in a position to apply for a job that defined itself as Yiddish language, literature, and culture when that opportunity came along in 2006, 2007. And that is how I came to be the Yiddishist at Emory. I'm going to talk about the moment when my specific contribution to my field, but I think also hopefully to Jewish culture and even to American culture more broadly started to take shape and define itself. My first book was about a good, I'm going to put in quotation marks that you can't see if you're listening to this through an audio format, but I'm going to put in quotation marks a good safe topic for my first book. It was squarely in the realm of literary studies, and it was about a form of the novel called the picaresque form, which involves first person narration by somebody who's usually at the margins of society. And the thing that really distinguishes the picaresque from other first person forms of the novel is that the episodes that develop in the story are very loosely connected. And there isn't necessarily a causal relationship between what happens in chapter 1 and what happens in chapter 2 and what happens in chapter 17. The hero, who I said is often from the margins of society, kind of pings around or caroms around collecting life lessons and sort of uh, like with a full tuition scholarship to the School of Hard Knocks. And so that is the picaresque. And that was a fine thing to write about for my first book. And I'm happy that I did. And it raises some interesting questions of education and cultural transmission that I'm still very concerned with. But it's not really what defines my career, I think. What I've been working on for the past decade is Yiddish children's literature and culture. And this is really an interdisciplinary inquiry that is strongly rooted in literary studies, which is what I was trained to do in graduate school once I actually enrolled. But it also verges on or even enters fully into a number of other disciplines like child psychology and a little bit of anthropology and definitely cultural studies and the sort of history of science aspect of the history of child psychology. And it's comparative, it involves Yiddish culture in relation to Anglo American culture, Russian children's literature, particularly during the Soviet period, Israeli children's literature and culture, especially during the nation building period before and immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So all of these different things are going on in the study of Yiddish children's literature. And I think the surprising thing about the way that I got there was that it was very much a convergence point between my work as a language instructor specifically, because I was teaching Yiddish language at Emory, and my situation as a mother of young children. At the time that I started this, I had two young children. Now I have two old children and one still fairly young. elementary school child who you might hear in the background bouncing around the house. But it was really, um, it was a kind of a moment where I said, you've studied Spanish, you've studied Hebrew, you've studied Arabic, and in all of those learning experiences, you are exposed to children's literature as part of the education. But that never happened with your Yiddish studies. Is there any children's literature in Yiddish? And an afternoon's worth of Google searching showed me that not only is there a really rich, almost endlessly rich children's literature that was published in Yiddish, but it has been almost entirely digitized, and it's just sitting there waiting for someone to do something with it. So then I thought, well, maybe there hasn't been that much interest in this literature because it's just really bad and it's not going to hold the interest of anyone reading today. So I started reading some of it. And I like to say that I've read more bad Yiddish children's stories than anyone else alive. I think that that's true. But I've also read more good and excellent children's stories in Yiddish than almost anyone else currently living. And so much of it is really fine, of great historical interest, but also of great aesthetic interest and even contemporary cultural interest. And so that's what I really want to underscore in my work. And so in 2020, I published an anthology of primary sources that you can't see because you're listening to this, but it has a very beautiful cover. It's called Honey on the Page, and I did not design the cover or actually make the art. The art is by Paula Cohen. So because other people did that, I feel like I can brag about it fully. But it's a book of the actual literature that really shows, I think, how engaging and how relevant it is to 21st century readers of all ages. And now I'm following that project up with a critical study that talks about why this literature is so relevant and so revealing of the recent Jewish past. And in addition to those kind of core scholarly projects, I am constantly on the lookout for opportunities to collaborate with artists who are going to help get this material out into the world and make it a resource for contemporary children and families. There have been two fully realized artistic collaborations that have grown out of this work so far. One is a puppet film called Labzik, Tales of a Clever Pup, that I was able to produce with a wonderful Emory alumnus and local director, actor, and puppeteer named Jake Krakowski, who graduated in 2014. Now, I have to say that even though I was at Emory when Jake was an undergraduate, he did not study Yiddish at the time. However, we encountered each other later when he was a recent graduate through a program that the Department of Theater put on, where he was invited to speak about an English Jewish playwright named Harold Pinter. And I was invited to speak also, even though I knew very little about Harold Pinter. But Jake and I met each other on that occasion, and we forged a good connection, and we became Facebook friends. So we were networked to the point that later on, when I held a fellowship at the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry at Emory, I then sort of paid it forward. Everyone who holds that fellowship does something to pay it forward, either by establishing a seminar at the Fox Center for the academic community, for the Emory community, or giving a public facing seminar. And I really wanted to do a short but hopefully rich public facing seminar about Yiddish children's literature. And that happened in autumn of 2019. And Jake and I were connected enough that I messaged him on Facebook and I said, "This is happening. It's free. I think you'd really like it. You should come if you can." And he did. And as we were about to start the final session, which was about the children's literature produced by leftists, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States. So, very similar political alignments and orientations, but very different kind of literature being produced with a very different tone and a very different feel. But as we were starting that session, I said to him, these Labzik stories about this adorable little mutt who gets adopted by a working class Jewish secular family, and then they go on adventures together and they stand up for the rights of the worker. Um, these stories would make a great puppet show, don't you think? And Jake sort of laughed, like, who's going to stage that, right? Like Yiddish, communist, children's, like it just doesn't sound like a winner in commercial terms. But he kept it in mind, and then he started coming to my Yiddish reading group. And the following summer, he went off to an intensive summer Yiddish program at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, where I happen to do a little bit of teaching every year in that program. And he started to become fluent in Yiddish. And then he came back to me the following autumn, and by then we found ourselves in the midst of a pandemic. It's now autumn 2020. And he said, "I'm falling in love with Yiddish, and I am thinking about projects that involve Yiddish, and Theater Emory wants to support work that can be done during the pandemic. What do you think of some sort of pandemic friendly puppet show around some of the Labzik stories that you're translating? How soon can you have the translation finished?" And I said, "You know what? I'll get right on that and I'll finish it up." And so I did, and we chose 4 stories that we wanted to adapt. And then the question was, how is this going to take shape? And for me, how could I stay involved with it? Because this felt like my baby, and I didn't want to just entirely hand it over and let go of it. And not because I felt possessive, but because I felt so excited about the material that I wanted to just stay involved in its life. And so we devised a very experimental theater course that would be cross-listed between the theater department and Jewish studies. And we conceived it as a kind of laboratory space or a creative hub for the making of this puppet show that would also involve us in learning about the history and the theory of Yiddish political theater. So we got some really adventurous undergraduates from the college and from Coisuera who were ready to go on a journey with us. I was able to hire Jake as an assistant in that course. And it was mostly students who were enrolled in that course who then auditioned for what became a bilingual production where the narrator spoke in English, and those were student actors, and the characters' dialogue was in Yiddish. And for that, we hired professional and also amateur Yiddish actors. So that's one collaboration. The other collaboration is an hour-long radio play that was put on by a community theater organization based in Seattle called Tales of the Alchemists. And they too were looking for pandemic friendly projects. So they had gone to a completely audio format during the pandemic instead of staging plays in person. And they decided to take 5 pieces from my anthology, Honey on the Page, and to perform them and to produce beautiful interstitial Yiddish and Yiddish inspired klezmer music, that's Eastern European Jewish music, to go in between these selections of prose and poetry. So that went live in January of 2022. And we'll see. I think that some of this material wants to be graphic novels. I think that some of it even wants to be animated. So if there is an enterprising young Emory alum listening to this who has those talents and that kind of interest, please get in touch. I had a very brief, one summer long, but very impactful opportunity to act in an improv theater group when I was about to be a senior in high school. And the takeaway for me was the ethos that really pervades the improv theater world of yes and. In other words, there is a proposition, something gets proposed, there's an idea on the table, and you don't rule anything out. It's always, let's incorporate that and add to it. And things unfold in a very organic but additive way because the spirit is yes, and let's also do this other thing and let's build on it in this way. And when I look back now at what is probably around the midpoint of my career, perhaps, I mean, one hopes for as long a career as possible. Um, but certainly I've come a good part of the journey. And I think that just retaining that spirit of openness to possibility, to suggestion, that's really encapsulated in that phrase, yes, and has made the most exciting, rewarding things possible and is also applicable to the widest range of interests and career paths and life paths. So the spirit of yes and we didn't really get to talk about it, which is entirely on me because I just didn't bring it up. But I'll also say that after I was tenured in 2015, I had a kind of unusual next project. This is while I was working on Honey on the Page and while I was working on the subsequent book. I went to rabbinical school and I became ordained as a rabbi in 2019. And this is something that came about very much because I was in that mindset of yes and. This is something that I would have loved to do earlier in my career had the opportunity presented itself. But this was the time when it came along. And so I enrolled as part of the first cohort of a new program for mid career Orthodox Jewish women who have the underlying skills and qualifications to really be trained in Jewish law the way that rabbis have traditionally been. And so that's a whole other arena for creativity, for teaching, for human connection, and it just all comes about through staying in that headspace of yes, and let's also do this other thing. You graduate and move into the world beyond Emory, try to also keep the spirit and the mentality of office hours alive. You may or may not have taken the fullest possible advantage of what I think of as the academic amenity that is a professor's office hours. But as you move into other professional realms, there will be similar kinds of encounters. You might have to ask for them. There might not be a structure that automatically exists and is presented to you, but people really love to connect in an informal way on a human level. And just remember that people want to share with you, they want to hear from you, they want to elicit what your own thoughts and questions and doubts and fears and hopes and aspirations are. So office hours, that would be the other idea I would mention.